Greetings, I'm Ted Morrissey, and this is the course on James Joyce's Ulysses in the Lindenwood University MFA in Writing program sequence. And I just wanted to give you a brief little introduction here. You have to make an opening video, so I thought, what's fair for you is fair for me. Probably I'm going to, cover some of the same material that I included in the opening introduction to the course in writing. But maybe I'll throw in a few new things too. A couple of quick disclaimers. At any moment you could hear one or two barking dogs. It seems to freak them out for me to be talking to my computer and not to them. So anyway, if that happens, my apologies. Also, I haven't used my computer for 2 or 3 weeks because I was out of town and it keeps wanting to update things while I'm making this video. So hopefully that won't throw me into too much confusion here. But again, this is a course focused on Joyce's Ulysses. I got the idea to propose this course to Lindenwood several months ago. My rationale is fairly simple. Many among you are story writers, novelists, aspiring novelists, and it seems to me that if you're in that boat, so to speak, that you could benefit from having some exposure to what's considered by many the greatest novel in the English language, or at least the greatest novel in the English language of the 20th century. Even those who don't, subscribe to its greatness per se, certainly have to agree of the influence of James Joyce in general and Ulysses in particular, whether it's his impact on other writers in the 20th century in particular. If you were, fancying yourself a serious novelist, the big, dense, sort of difficult novel seemed to be something you had to produce. Whether it was William Gaddis's The Recognitions and other books, whether it was Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, Mason and Dixon, etc. John Barth certainly produced his fair share of big, challenging books. My own beloved William H. Gass, his mega novel The Tunnel, is certainly a book I would say that was inspired by Joyce's Ulysses and so forth. In fact, Gass frequently alludes to Joyce and Ulysses and other Joyce texts in his various reviews, his literary criticism, and in his copious interviews. So its influence is definitely widespread. It also had a major impact on freedom of speech, and we'll get into some of those things throughout the quarter as we work our way through the book. Before I go any further, though, I just want to thank you for signing up for this class. As I say elsewhere in the written introductions and so forth, I'm sure there were other things you could have taken that would be perhaps less daunting than working your way through Joyce's Ulysses. But I do think that it's going to be time well spent, and my expectations, I think, are fairly reasonable. It's not a book that can be mastered in a single quarter, and we will be doing our best to make sense of it as we go through. Had to stop briefly there, let the dogs out. Probably have to let them back in about 60 seconds, but we'll do our best here. So anyway, back to Joyce and Ulysses and the rationale for this class. So I do think, as I said, that you'll benefit from it. I think it's good to have a sort of working familiarity with the text, even though we can't master it, in the given amount of time. I've been working with the text for years, not as a Joyce scholar, but just as sort of a Joyce enthusiast, etc. And I just barely feel like I have a handhold on the text, let alone anything starting to approach what could be called a mastery of the text. Joyce scholars will pick out a particular aspect of the text and spend their whole careers working on it and never really feel like they have completely, plumbed all the depths of that particular aspect of the novel. But I do think that a sort of working familiarity with the text is really useful to anyone who who teaches literature, who is involved in sort of English circles, writing circles, whatever you want to call it. And probably more importantly, for the aspect of what can we get out of it as writers ourselves, it is an encyclopedia of sorts of different techniques of narration. Some of them, wildly experimental. Some of them nowadays not considered all that experimental, like stream of consciousness, for example, which was a new sort of thing in Joyce's day. Virginia Woolf, Joyce, and company, and it's pretty familiar territory today. But beyond that, there are just numerous things that Joyce does in the text that we can take a look at from sort of a stylistic, mechanical almost perspective, and perhaps modify or what have you into our own narrative techniques. Not that we would want to necessarily throw all of the techniques into a single book as Joyce has done here, but for a given short story, for a given writing project, we might find one or two or three of the techniques that Joyce employs, maybe somewhat modified, based on our own ideas, to be quite useful and to give us ways of getting into the texts we're writing that we couldn't necessarily do if we were just kind of approaching it from a more standard narrative technique point of view. So, basic understanding of the text, hopefully some tools to add to our own toolbox in terms of being writers, and from a readerly standpoint, in spite of its reputation for being difficult, and it is challenging. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it here. It's enjoyable. It's funny. It's touching at times. It certainly speaks to a lot of the issues that everyday people deal with in their everyday lives. Now, it dramatizes them in ways that probably we don't encounter on a regular basis, and it unfolds over the course of a single day, more or less. And we, generally speaking, don't have those kinds of days where we, run into all of these different kinds of ideas and things happening. So it's compressed in that way. But I think most people find things that they can certainly relate in it. Again, it has a reputation for difficulty. It's a big book. And so nowadays, we have a tendency to prefer shorter works. So that in itself is kind of daunting. But I've tried to carve up the book as best I can in the installments that we have for the course in 11 weeks. It's difficult. We really could, spend an entire, couple of semesters, let leave be a quarter, looking at the book and still, just sort of feel like we're scratching the surface in many ways. But we are going to do our best to get through the entire book and get some understanding out of it, and again acquire some of those narrative techniques that I hope that we can. Just a few words here. As you know, I've chosen the Oxford edition of the text. I thought long and hard about which edition to put on the syllabus, and I know some of you ended up with a different version of the text, and that's okay. But this was the one I thought might be the most useful for a couple of reasons. As I mentioned elsewhere, Joyce scholars tend to think about three different versions of the text. That's a little bit misleading because obviously there's been many editions printed over time. In fact, scholars disagree on exactly how many editions have been published, over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. But all those editions tend to be sort of branches of these three basic texts. There's the original 1922 text. There's the 1961 Random House Bodley Head corrected text, and then there's the Gobbler Text that came out in the 80s, which is also a corrected text of sort, but it varies from the 1961 corrected text. And I've written about those things a little bit more in my introductions, and you can read a lot more about them if you want to. But both the 61 text and the Gobbler text from the 80s have, they're corrected in some ways, but they each have their issues too. And so a lot of people feel like the original 1922 text, even though it has a lot of printing errors and things like that in it, that it's the only one that was actually authorized by Joyce. And so in some ways it may be the most pure. So the Oxford edition, as I mentioned, is the 1922 text, but it's also filled with other kinds of information, introductory material about the book, about Joyce, about his publishing history, notes on the different errors and trying to correct those in some ways, a lot of gloss about a lot of the allusions and so forth that if you want to get into, you're certainly welcome to. But again, I know some of you have already contacted me indicating that you're using different texts, and that's okay too. I tend to go back to this text when I deal with Joyce. This is the Gobbler text. Not that I am saying this is definitely the best of the three versions. It happens just to be the first that I got a hold of one day many years ago, and it's a used copy, so it's kind of an interesting combination now of my own notes and the notes of the original owner, who I don't know who that was, and quite honestly, I can't read some of his notes. I assume it was a he. It's probably sexist of me, and maybe because the handwriting is so bad, that's part of it. But also I literally can't read a lot of the notes, and some of the notes I can read. I don't really quite know why he was, highlighting the things he was. But on the other hand, some of his notes I found to be quite useful and quite interesting. So anyway, the Gobbler text is the one I tend to go back to. Although the first version that I read in its entirety was the 1961 version, and even though I had gotten that Gobbler text years ago, quite frankly, at that time I hadn't really cracked it open. Didn't really get through Ulysses. I was like a lot of readers. I tried it and got bogged down in it, and went away from it, etc. But eventually, I came back to Ulysses just because I felt like it was a book I needed really to be able to read and understand and so forth. And so I got then the 61 edition and read that, and that kind of got me going. And since then I've been, again, not a Joyce scholar, but certainly an enthusiast, a devotee, whatever word you want to use, and certainly am interested not only in his work, but also just in him as a writer and sort of his history and his impact on publishing and all kinds of things. So there are those three editions. You could approach it a somewhat different way. As we know, the book was serially published, prior to its 1922 original book publication, mostly in the Little Review, also somewhat in the Egoist. And this book by Yale University Press, the Little Review, Ulysses, is a really interesting read. This brings together those Little Review serial editions and talks about them in the context of the other pieces that appeared in those Little Review issues, and really makes some interesting cases or points about what the editors perhaps were trying to suggest via the combination of authors and pieces that they brought together in each of those issues, not to mention their own editorial comments and so on. Again, really interesting. It's not complete because the Little Review editors were not able to publish all of Ulysses serially. I think the Oxton of the Sun is the final episode that was actually published in the Little Review because of all kinds of reasons, not the least of which was the fines and the jail time and so forth that the editors faced and went through because of obscenity charges and all kinds of things. That's a whole nother issue, which we'll, of course, touch on somewhat during the course. So that slowed things down, not to mention Joyce's own, kind of ponderous writing style. Nevertheless, looking at those serial editions is interesting. And in fact, for your big papers in the course, your midterm and your final, what I'm asking you to do is to use a database. Let me see if I can call it up here. It's the Modernist Networks database, and there's links, obviously, in the program or in the syllabus. And anyway, use this to access the digital copies of some of those serialized episodes, and to pick one out in particular, hopefully one that you're especially interested in, and take a look at the serial edition versus the 1922 book published edition, and take a look at the changes and and analyze perhaps why those changes took place and what their effect is in terms of the text and so on. What we know is that Joyce was an obsessive revisionist when it came to his work. So there are significant differences between the original serialized editions of the episodes and the final 1922 editions. Almost always, Joyce was adding to the text. I mean, you can find examples where he struck out words or whole phrases and things like that. But by and large, what he was doing was adding more and more and more material every time he revised, and he revised some of the episodes, multiple times. In fact, he was sort of infamous for that. His original printers would send him proof copies, and he would not just correct them, he would continue writing and revising the text as he sent them back, and then again and again and again. And what he often was adding was some of the material that, quite frankly, makes it a little more challenging. The sort of the layers of allusions, the layers of symbolism, adding, more obscure non-English words, whether it was from some classical language, Greek or Hebrew or Latin, or whether it was from Italian or German or what have you. And so he tended to making the text more dense and more challenging. So some people find reading the original serialized episodes actually a little easier to understand, and that kind of helps them then to go back to the 1922 text, and maybe make some sense of some things that they might find just sort of buried in too much, too many layers of allusion or whatever it might be. This is true of Finnegan's Wake too, by the way, which is another book I'm just really kind of working on now, even though I've kind of been working at it for a while. But it also came out in serial editions prior to its publication, book publication. And again, in every case, Joyce was adding, layers of obscurity, if you will, to Finnegan's Wake. And so if you go back and read the original serialized editions, they tend to be a little bit easier to grasp in some ways than the book version of Finnegan's Wake. But I'm kind of getting off the beaten track here. So anyway, those are going to be your big papers. And besides giving us some insight into Ulysses' text itself, I think that as writers, it really is useful to look at that revision process of Joyce's, and just how much those episodes changed. Now, some of the changes, quite frankly, were editorial changes, usually because of the fact that the editors, while they were determined to have their freedom of speech before freedom of speech was really guaranteed in the publishing world, they also were sensitive to the fact that the copies of the issues would be seized, could be seized, would be burned, they could be prosecuted. So in some cases, different editors' hands, try to remove some of the more overtly, what they perceive to be offensive, or what some people would perceive to be as offensive language, images, etc. Some of the changes are editorial, but for the most part, the changes are Joyce's, again, adding layers of symbolism, layers of allusions of different kinds, historical, literary, etc. So I think looking at that process and how much work he put into the revisions, really maybe kind of underscores the importance of revision for us. Not that we're always going to go back and add the sorts of layers of things that Joyce did, but certainly the effort that he put into it and the thought that he put into it is something we all should consider for our own revision and so forth. So that's pretty much the course as I have it laid out. I know the reading load is heavy. I apologize for that. Just really no avoiding it. It's a big book, and we only have 11 weeks. But as I say elsewhere, I know you're not superhuman. I know that you have lives beyond this course. Some of you are probably even taking this course in addition to maybe another course. So you've got a double reading load. So I can only ask you to make a good faith effort. I encourage you to be honest, in the sense of if you have questions, join the club. If you have questions, ask them on the discussion board, etc. And I'll do my best to answer them. We'll all kind of pitch in and do our best to answer them. Oftentimes, I may not have an answer, or I just have a theory, or whatever. So having questions about the text is perfectly natural. Also, if you have to acknowledge that there was, a reading assignment that you didn't read as slowly and as carefully as you would normally like to read an assignment for a class, just because of the sort of unrealistic time frame that we're in many ways trying to deal with here, that's fine. It's understandable. So I think it's always better to be sort of straightforward and honest, and we'll have just a better experience all around as opposed to trying to sort of, fake our way through or whatever. There aren't any quizzes per se. It's not a reading comprehension kind of class. It's again, getting a kind of foundational working knowledge of the text, hoping to find some aspects of it that we particularly, like or identify with or admire in some way, and then working a little bit more with those, kind of razor sharp, slices of the text, and maybe getting a little more involved in those particular pieces. I think if we can accomplish that by the end of the 11 weeks, we will have done well. I think we'll be better off as writers and maybe as human beings even. So by all means, if you have questions, contact me. Some of you already have, prior to the course's beginning, which I appreciate because that's already resulted in some revisions to the course as it's set up online. And so I always feel like if you do have some questions or some suggestions, that those are always good things. And oftentimes they lead me to improving, the course for everyone. So don't be shy about making suggestions, asking questions, that kind of thing. So I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too. And there you have it. Happy reading.